Hi friends, the topic of our discussion today is contract law, and it's a very important subject for all of us to study because it's a substantive law, and the in every aspect of life you will realize that we seem to be reaching an agreement to do whatever we want to do, and that agreement then is results into a contract if enforceable in law. And you will realize that in almost every relationship except our relatives and friends, in whether it's employment law or it is any other law, wherever we deal with, whatever aspect we deal with, it is a subject which we have to understand in our day-to-day life. It is, as I said, substantive law, and I will start giving you the background of the Indian Contract Act. Before its enactment, contract law covered almost all branches, including partnership, sale of goods, whatever. But when the framers commenced when the framers started drafting this law, they decided that they shall keep the subject of partnership and sale of goods separate from it. And I shall shortly come to what they did later on in enacting several other statutes. Now, friends, the framers, when they were deciding to draft the law for India, which ultimately became the Indian Contract Act 1872, they borrowed the its provisions from various other codes of other countries. The man mainly responsible for drafting, and his inputs were very acknowledged, was Sir James Stephen, who was also responsible for drafting Indian Evidence Act. Now, Indian Contract Act does not profess to be, it is not a complete code. And wherever its provisions are not, they don't deal with a particular subject, the courts then borrow the principles of equity, fair play, justice, and of course, principles and precedents of English law as far as they are applicable to Indian society and circumstances. Friends, the Indian Contract Act is, as I said a moment ago, is not a complete code. The framers decided that they shall keep the Sale of Goods Act and partnership separate, and therefore this act was left to deal with agency, bailment, and including the sale, other aspects of sale and dealings. But the framers then decided to enact separate statutes. And those separate statutes were, for example, after its enactment, the separate statutes were the Negotiable Instrument Act of 1881, Transfer of Property Act 1882, Indian Railways Act 1890, and Power of Attorney Act of 1882, which has been deleted. And such separate statutes were then enacted following the enactment of Indian Contract Act 1872. Friends, after the coming into force of the Indian Constitution, the Indian Contract Act continued to be in operation by virtue of Article 372(1) of the Indian Constitution. We should all know and I must emphatically assert that we should all know this, that any provision of Indian Contract Act which is inconsistent with the fundamental rights as enshrined in the Constitution will be held violated, will be void by virtue of Article 13 of the Constitution. Now, friends, as I said, this act had to be, uh, you know, brought up to date in line with the developments that were taking in Indian law. And therefore, in 1958, Law Commission of India, under the very, very able stewardship of an eminent jurist, M.C. Setalwad, made certain recommendations. And those recommendations were that, and I will read them, those recommendations were that modification, number one, modification of the doctrine of privity to entitle a third party to be able to sue on a contract which had been made for his benefit. The second was, which was very important, recognition of the principle of promissory estoppel. Third was to make an agreement enforceable even without consideration and keep the offer open for a definite period of time. And to make the wagering agreements and collateral agreements unlawful. And friends, to include the principle of material alteration. Now, let's understand this. We have always said material alteration in the documents must be rejected. And therefore, Law Commission said to include the principle regarding material alteration to documents. And the sixth recommendation was to permit reasonable restraint in the right to carry on the trade. Friends, later on, in 1984, Law Commission made another recommendation, and that was the recommendation regarding specific amendment relating to the prescriptive clauses. This was accepted by the framers, by our lawmakers in the year 1997, and Section 28 was inserted and amended to accommodate the recommendation of prescriptive clauses. Later on, our Law Commission further made some recommendation, and that was to make the promises enforceable even though without consideration, if they were acted upon, and gave limits for operation of promissory estoppel. Friends, again in 2006, Law Commission recommended dealing with the substance and procedure of unfair terms in the contract. Friends, I will now like to explain to you Friends, while we are dealing with this, let me say that it is very, very important for future judicial officers to note that the extent to which the Act deals with a particular subject, it is exhaustive. And as Honorable Supreme Court held in the case of Bhagwan Das Govardhan Das Kedia versus Girdhari Lal Purushottam Das and Company, that it would not be permissible to import the principles of English law to horse the statutory provisions unless the statute is such that it could not be understood without the aid of English law, or where any matter cannot be brought within the provisions of the Contract Act. You will all understand that we cannot begin to make references to English law because our Indian Contract Act is comprehensive enough to the extent to which it deals with a particular subject. Now, it's very interesting, friends. Let me explain to you that if you understand Section 2 and its subclauses, then you understand almost the entire spirit of the Contract Act. What is it? Let's see. It's a very common. It's something of a common sense. Let's say that somebody wants some other person to give his assent or to do something or not to do something, and therefore what he says, as we do always, man makes a proposal to somebody. In English law, it is called offer. In India, we call it proposal. That's what is the subclause A. What is the purpose of making a proposal? The purpose is that we want to get that other person's assent. What is that other person? Who is that other person? Offeree, to whom we make an offer or to whom we make a proposal. That offeree, if he or she gives the assent, then that becomes a promise. Obviously, that's clause B. And now that two parties have been created, there is a proposer, there is a offeree or a promisee, and therefore that person, now there is a promiser and there is a promisee. And what is the background of this? Friends, in general, nobody accepts, nobody, does something for somebody without some consideration. So law recognizes that there is consideration. Of course, I will come later on to where I will say that in family relations, in blood relations, there is no consideration because we do every day. A mother does something for you, a father does something for you, you do something for your father, or a wife does something for you, you do something. So in those relations and in social relations for friendship, I take you for a coffee, you take me for a coffee. There is no consideration. But in normal relationships, there is a consideration. And when there is a consideration, it leads to an agreement. And when you joined law class in the very first class, when the contract law was taught to you, you were told what is a contract? An agreement enforceable at law. So if that's so, now an agreement has been reached, it has to be enforceable. Friends, there have to be some other clauses that we deal with. That subclause F says there could be a reciprocal promise. Now, what's that reciprocal promise? Generally, a builder sells you a flat and says, I also agree to repurchase it if you like to sell it to me after a year, 2 or 6 months at a certain price. that becomes a reciprocal promise. Now, friends, there are basically some contracts which are void, some contracts which are voidable. And void is dealt with in subclause G, voidable is in I. What is void contract which is not valid in law? And that is, let's say I say to you, I will help you make some profit in purchasing the shares or selling or in dealing in the shares by astrology. Now that is absolutely, law will not recognize such contracts, even if you accept my offer and enter into a consideration. The consideration could be 5,000, 10,000 rupees or 1,000 rupees or whatever. Then, friends, H is contract, which is an agreement enforceable at law. Voidable is where you could, if you like, at the option of the promisee, you could say you will not accept the contract. And then there is avoidance of voidable contract, which I will deal as I come to the sections. That is subsection J. Thank you, friends. We shall deal with it later. Friends, in my previous talk, I was telling you about the subsections of section 2, the clauses A to J, and I was saying that they are the key to understanding of the formation of the agreement which leads to an enforceable contract. Today, friends, let's understand what these clauses in their true context are. A says person signifies his willingness to do or to abstain from doing anything with a view to obtaining the assent. And let's say A says to B, you and I are the only two people who have been called for interview. I will not go to the interview if you agree to pay me 5,000 rupees. Then you are the only candidate left to, and your chances of selection are better. B says yes to that proposal. For the consideration of 5,000, it becomes an agreement. So what we have understood is that there is a proposal, there is an offeree, there is a consideration, and once the offeree conveys his assent, it becomes a promise. Now there are two parties, promiser and promisee, and the consideration is rupees 5,000, it becomes an agreement. How an agreement is reached ultimately with what, and the clauses which make it further enforceable or not, are we shall take it up later as we come to section 7, 10, etc. And here, the word signifies has the meaning that it has to be a proposal which has to be accepted in its true form. And thereafter we go to J, which says every promise, every set of promises forming the consideration is an agreement. And thereafter we say reciprocal promises, and we then say an agreement, a contract which ceases to be enforceable becomes void when it ceases to be. That is, if, for example, there is a contract today which becomes void by virtue of the fact that a legislation has been brought which has made it now unenforceable, then it has ceased to be enforceable. Friends, we shall go further, but let us understand the agreement can be reached by the process of offer and acceptance. And every transaction to be recognized as a contract must, in ultimate analysis, result into a proposal and its absolute and unqualified acceptance. Friends, again, as I have said before, proposal, what is proposal in Indian Contract Act 1872 is they call it offer in English law, and it is said to be made when one person signifies to another his willingness to do or to abstain from doing, with a view, the purpose being to obtain the assent. And the objective test of intention in making a proposal is as it would be reasonably construed by the person in the position of the offeree. Mind you, we are saying reasonably construed or reasonably understood by the person to whom the offer has been made. And a proposal must be distinguished from a mere statement of intention which is not intended to require acceptance. Let's say I today say to you, I am going on a 1 month excursion travel to Europe and I will be taking somebody with me. Now I am not making an offer to you. I have not made it. I am merely making a statement. It has to be distinguished from making a proposal. Friends, let's go on. The distinction between offer and invitation to treat depends upon the intention of the person who is making it. And the person making a proposal would be bound no sooner the offeree conveys his assent. If it is a true proposal, then he is bound as soon as the offeree accepts it. However, let's now understand the scope of certain exceptions, because we tend to confuse that. Let's say there is a voluntary retirement scheme offered by a company. Now, it's not a proposal. It is merely an invitation to treat. So is also a quotation of prices, where a person asks for quotation, and they are merely invitation to offer, and so is the auctioneer's request for bids. If a tender is lodged, it must be certain, sufficiently definite to reach a concluded contract by mere acceptance. It can come from a third person who suggests to prospective parties the terms of the agreement, and an offer can be made to an individual, it can be made to a specified group of persons, or even to the world at large. It may be a specific offer, it may be a general offer, and the word signifies in the definition indicates that it has to be communicated to the person to whom it is made. Another very, very important aspect of the proposal is that it must be such as can be reasonably regarded as having been made in contemplation of creating legal consequences. Because, friends, an agreement cannot be complete without the intent to create legal relations. Even if there is consideration, a contractual relationship may be negated by statements which are made jocularly, in joke, or anger. Also, an arrangement which is believed simply to give effect to pre-existing rights, like somebody's salary is due and you pay, it's not a contract performance. It's not because the parties had no intention to enter into a contract. Now, please understand that in a commercial transaction, it is not necessary to prove, it is given. It is not at all required to prove that such an intention requires the onus to prove. The onus is always on the party which disputes the intention, and the onus of proving that there was no such intention lies on the person who asserts it. And mind you, friends, it's a very heavy burden. These were the words where Lord Moulton said there must be animus contrahendi. Lord Moulton was saying this in deciding the case Gafluck versus Cantor, 1985 to Lloyd's. I must also mention here Halsbury, who said when any two people meet and discuss business, they intend legal consequences to follow. So friends, it is taken that in business relationship, there are legal consequences which flow. However, there are exceptions to this rule. In family matters, in social relations, the intention not to create legal relation is understood. It's implied what you do for family people and what they do for you. There is no legal relationship in that. So also in what you do among friends, that's also something where legal relationship is neither understood nor implied. But there is no reason why in business matters, the parties should not rely on mutual good faith and honor. Again, a proposal subject to contract does not create a contract when accepted, because it is only indicating that the proposer is not entering into a binding contract until a formal agreement has been executed. Let me give you two more examples here. A letter requesting a loan of money and promising repayment with interest on a certain date is not a promissory note, nor it is but a mere proposal for a loan. Similarly, an underwriting letter which contained the words, "This engagement is binding on me for a period of 2 months." Now, these words were incapable of operating as a promise. It was an offer with limit of 2 months given for acceptance, where a person intends to be bound without further negotiations by a simple acceptance of his terms. His expression shall be offer or proposals. Friends, now come to options. There are contracts of options where the grantor of the option offers to enter into what may be called a major contract with a second person and makes a separate contract to keep his offer open. Such a contract may exist either as a separate option contract or as a part of a large contract, such as a sale with an option of repurchase granted either to the seller or buyer. The effect of such a contract of option is to create an irrevocable offer and a power of acceptance. Whether, now you have to really distinguish. It's a matter of construction, whether a statement is an agreement or an option. And we have to be careful in drawing a clear distinction between what is, whether it's a matter, it's a mere statement, or is it something that we have given an option. That's a matter of construction. Friends, clause B now defines acceptance and promise. The word which is very important here is signifies his assent. And the signifying Ratifying the assent means that it has to be accepted in clear terms and in the same form in which it has been prescribed by the proposer. Now we are saying here, section 7 lends further support to it. It says, acceptance is final and unqualified expression of assent to the terms of the offer. An unqualified, unconditional acceptance of the offer creates a contract when communicated to the offerer. Let's say the company passes a resolution accepting the proposal, but it does not convey that back to the proposer. This is no acceptance. Similarly, if I accept the proposal made by somebody to me, but I only say this to my employee or my agent who does not convey it and give him no authority to convey it back to the proposer, this is no acceptance, because section 7 says when communicated to the offerer. Similarly, section 3 of this act says acceptance may be communicated either by an act or by omission. Now, this is a very vast expression by which the offeree intends to communicate or has the effect of communicating. Obviously, there can be an acceptance by conduct, there can be acceptance by omission, where you simply perform what you have been asked to do, and you by that, or you do something which you have been proposed to do, and it clearly says that you accept what has been proposed to you. Again, section 4 gives it a vast expression. It says the communication is complete as against the proposer. That means the proposer has made an offer. The communication so made is complete when it is put into the course of transmission to him, so as to be out of the reach of the acceptor, and as against the acceptor when it reaches the proposer. Now, mind you, the difference is as against the acceptor, it has to reach the proposer, but as against the proposer when it is put into the course of the transmission. Section 5 deals with revocation. Section 7, as I said previously, that acceptance must be absolute, unconditional. But what is very important here is to understand that you cannot part accept the terms. It has to be acceptance either of all the terms or not. And also in the manner, if any, prescribed by the proposer. If he says, give it to me in writing, give it to me on your letterhead, also signed, then the acceptance will be only if you say, yes, I accept, you do print it on your letterhead, you sign it. And then you send it. And either through the courier or through the post, but as per section 4, it will be it will be against you when it reaches the proposer. Again, friends, section 9 says, acceptance may be expressed or implied. It may be, previously in section 3 we said it may be by the act or by omission. Here we are saying by express or implied. The assent may be by express words or positive conduct. Objective test of the agreement applies to an acceptance. However, a letter of intent merely indicating intention to enter into a contract with the other party in future, it's not intended to bind the other party to enter into a contract. Friends, we shall close here today, but we shall take it up further in my next talk. Thank you. Gentlemen, I have been dealing with the subject of offer and acceptance, but the courts have clearly held that there cannot be acceptance of a proposal which has not come to the knowledge of the offeree. So therefore, what is being proposed has to be understood by the offeree. And as I said, it has to be what he perceives, how he takes it, what the offer was. And the acceptance also, in the same way, the acceptance must be communicated back to the offerer. Now, unless the acceptance is conveyed to the proposer, there cannot be an acceptance. Merely interdepartmental communication, as I have written here, proposing acceptance or mere resolution of acceptance by a company would not result into a contract. Let's say somebody has offered to sell you certain goods to your company, and your company directors then meet, pass a resolution, accept that offer, but that resolution is not conveyed back to the company which offered to sell the goods to you. And this resolution only is sitting in your books, then it is not acceptance. There have been cases where such resolutions by the employees were copied and in an unauthorized manner sent to the offerer. And the offerers tried to say that the offeree has accepted it. No, it has to be, that was not held to be a valid acceptance. What has to be done is that the acceptance must be conveyed in the form in which the offerer has prescribed. So it has to be conveyed back to the offerer. It has to be conveyed in the form in which it has been prescribed. If he has said, please record your acceptance in writing and sign, then it has to be on a paper, on your, maybe if it is your letterhead, then maybe on your letterhead, and also it has to be signed. And if he has prescribed it should be stamped, then it has to be stamped. Further, there cannot be a cent without the knowledge of the offer. So as I have just now said, a vague offer is no offer. So offeree must understand what is the offer and reliance upon it, and there is no contract where acceptance is communicated not to the proposer, but to one's agent. Let's say I say to my employee, okay, we accept this proposal. And I even sign on the file and I give it to my employee, but it is not conveyed back to the offerer. Then it is no acceptance, friends. There is no assent. Now, friends, I am dealing with the aspect of promise, where I have said that upon acceptance, the proposal becomes a promise. A liability under contract cannot arise unless the contract has been concluded. However, rights may be conferred by a statute in respect of relationships falling short of being promises. For example, I have given the example here. Let's say somebody applies for a housing scheme of DDA in Delhi or any development authority outside. Then Customer Protection Act, Consumer Protection Act 1986 may help such an applicant. Now, again, friends, a promise defined is not the same thing as an agreement, because a contract is a promise or a set of promises which law will enforce. This clause read with E, H, and section 10 indicates that a promise is an agreement and is enforceable if it satisfies the conditions given in section 10. And I shall, in my next lecture, I shall define the scope of section 10 in its proper context. Friends, promisor and promisee, very simple. It is that I have said that the person making the proposal is called a promisor. The person accepting is called promisee. Person here, of course, includes corporates, government, and at least two persons are required to make the promise. The promisee is the person, sorry for the wrong typo here. The promisee is a person who is a party to the contract. It must be noted that heirs of a promisee or assignee of a promisee cannot claim to be the promisees. Now, what we are emphasizing here is that a promisee has certain distinct rights, but his heirs and assignees do not have the right. And they could not claim what the promisee could claim. Madras High Court, this is a Madras High Court judgment in Alluri, China, Vapanna. Friends, I will further like to say that this is entirely backed up by consideration as defined in section D. And when how we define the section says, when at the desire of the promisor, the promisee or any other person has done or abstained from doing, the word is desire or request of the promisor from doing, to abstain from doing, such act or abstinence or promise is called a consideration. Purpose of the consideration is to put some legal limits on enforceability of agreements and to establish which promises should be legally enforceable. A valuable consideration may be either a right, interest, profit, benefit, or even forbearance, loss, detriment. It's a very wide definition. Or responsibility given or suffered. Friends, in Midland Bank Trust Company versus Green, Appellate Court of England held only those promises which are supported by consideration are enforceable. Others are not binding, even if the promisor intends to bind himself by the promise. Among the limitations on the enforcement of promises, the requirement of consideration is described as the most fundamental. Now, friends, consideration is not an act of agreed price, as it is a performance, if it is already a performance agreed. Now, promissory estoppel is an exception to the consideration, because a promise in future creates an estoppel. What is that? The principle behind the promissory estoppel is that if a promise is made in the expectation that it would be acted upon, and it was in fact acted upon, the party making the promise will not be allowed to back out of it. That, as I said, is an exception. Again, consideration is a notion of bargain. It is the price of a promise, a return, or a quid pro quo for a promise made. As I have quoted this Calcutta High Court judgment, Fazluddin Mandal versus Panchanand Das. And if there is, I was just saying this, if it is an act of the payment of agreed price, as the act of the payment of price is the performance of promise already agreed, Supreme Court has held consideration then would have the meaning as in section 2D of the act and has approved it as being practically the same. I was just saying it to you that the doctrine of promissory estoppel is a departure or an exception from the doctrine of consideration. The principles of promissory estoppel have been enunciated by Honorable Supreme Court very, very clearly in the famous case of Motilal Padampat Sugar Mills Company versus State of UP in AIR 1979. Besides that, Supreme Court has also given the principles of promissory estoppel in the case of the state of Bihar versus that sugar mill. It's a case of an Afghan agency or something like that. The other cases which I will deal with it presently. Now, friends, we have said that the contracts may be of two classes, where we are saying the consideration is executed and others where it is executory. So there are two types of contracts, executed contracts and executory contracts. The distinction as in this case is being made by Supreme Court in Union of India versus Chaman Lal Luna in 1957 Supreme Court. A consideration which insists on performance is said to be executed. And where the consideration consists in promise, it is said to be executory. It should be very clear that where the consideration insisted is sorry, let me say this again. A consideration insisted is for performance, it is said to be executed. And where the consideration consists in promise, it is said to be executory. Again, it may be stated that the consideration is executed when an act is performed in return for promise, and the promise is unilateral. What is that? Some child has been lost and somebody announces a reward offered to the person who finds such a person, or an article has been lost and there is a reward announced and hands it over. This is the example of in this case. A promise to do something in future is a legal consideration, provided it involves legal obligation. The detriment suffered by here by the promisee is the essence of consideration. Let me say this again. There is a promise to do something in future, and that's a legal consideration. The detriment suffered by the promisee is the essence of such a consideration. A compromise of a claim arising out of illegal contract is insufficient as a consideration unless the compromise arises out of a dispute of fact as to whether the contract is in fact illegal. Yes, somebody says the contract is legal, somebody says it's illegal. If such a compromise arises, then we have to see whether that dispute arises out of whether the contract is in fact illegal or legal. But the consideration must be real, a meritorious or gratuitous consideration, such as love and affection or obedience and submission by way of respect, is not good or valuable consideration. And therefore, for somebody to say, nor an expectation of spiritual and moral benefit. So somebody to say, you do this for me and I will be grateful, or I will give you a marriage certificate, or that you will have my affection, or it is for my affection you do this for me, or I will be always very obedient to you. All these are not good consideration, nor is some person saying, oh, you will be morally benefited or you will be spiritually elevated. No such things. That's the case of Patna High Court, Devi Saran Koiri versus Nandlal Chobe. Friends, promise should not be obviously impossible. Courts do not generally concern themselves with adequacy of consideration, nor do they audit the bargain made by the parties. Also, third parties cannot challenge the existence or adequacy of consideration. The performance of what one is already bound to do, either by general law or specific obligation, is not a good consideration. So, friends, it is actually the courts see it. They generally don't know how much I may do something for 10 rupees. Or I might give legal advice for 10 rupees, or I might give legal advice for 10,000 rupees. The courts do not audit this. They do not see the adequacy of consideration. And no third parties cannot challenge the existence or adequacy of the consideration. Nobody can say, why did you charge only 10 rupees for giving the legal advice to Salve? The performance of what one was already bound to do. For example, if there was already an existing obligation to do something, then that's not a consideration. Again, friends, that a contract cannot confer rights or impose obligations arising under it on any person except the parties to it. No one but the parties to the contract can be entitled under it or bound by it. This principle is known as the doctrine of privity. However, contracting parties may confer rights or benefits upon a third party, but the third party on whom such right is conferred can neither sue nor can he rely on defenses based on the contract. Also, the parties to a contract cannot impose liabilities on third parties. But friends, third party for whose benefit a contract is made may sue on it, but the party making the contract may sue only for specific performance for the benefit of the third party. Let's say if I am a party to the contract and I have made it or bestowed some some benefit on my employee, then if I want to enforce it, I'll have to enforce it by way of specific performance. But my employee could sue on the contract because there is something for his benefit. If also, and the plaintiff cannot recover more than the amount mentioned in the contract. Friends, I will mention one more case here. Krishnalal Sadhu versus Pramila Baladevi, where Chief Justice Rankin observed that there is nothing in Section 2 to encourage the idea that the contracts can be enforced by a person who is not a party to the contract. But this notion is rigidly excluded by definition of promise and promisee. And that is why I said that the Law Commission in its 87th report in 1958 recommended incorporation of Section 37A to enable a third party to enforce a contract in his own name if the contract conferred a benefit on him, but subject to defenses available to contracting parties. Friends, I will conclude by saying the rules of privity and consideration reflect separate issues of policy, and the rule of privity relates to who can enforce the contract, and that of consideration is about the types of promises which can be enforced. Thank you, friends. We shall continue from here. Friends, last time I was dealing with the benefits available to the contracting parties and the liabilities that they can, whether they or they cannot pass on to the third parties. Now, this has to be also seen in the context of the recommendations made by the Law Commission of India in 1958. And I have said, among the remedies available to the promisee for the benefit of third party, one is the specific performance. Third party for whose benefit a contract has been made may not sue on the contract, but the party making the contract may sue for specific performance for the benefit of third party, even though the damages may be nominal. So also in the suit for damages, the plaintiff cannot recover more than the amount mentioned or required for compensating him for his own loss and not that of the third party. Again, friends, even if a party is a party to the contract and there is an arbitration clause in the contract, it does not bind the third party, where the third party or one of the contracting parties have the same directors, and the third party has received goods under the contract and has paid for the goods, acted in terms of the contract, and has indicated in the prospectus that it was bound by the contract. We shall, of course, see that Section 45 of the Arbitration and Conciliation Act 1996 does enable non-signatory parties to the agreement with arbitration to pray for and be referred to arbitration in certain exceptional cases. Friends, I have been mentioning to you in my previous talks that the family arrangements and marriage settlements, the considerations, the issue of consideration does not arise. However, the Specific Relief Act 1963 enables specific performance of a contract being a settlement on marriage and family arrangement at a suit of any person beneficially entitled thereunder, and creates an exception to the rule that a party to the contract cannot sue. However, as Allahabad High Court held in Mittal Sen versus Dattaram, it should be noted the fact that an agreement has been entered into by persons who are relations of each other does not make such an agreement a family settlement so as to be binding on the person who are not even parties thereto. This is an old judgment, but still relevant. However, friends, the equitable exception to the doctrine of privity applies, and I am saying it's only an equitable exception where the contract is made in consideration of marriage and intended beneficiary is within the marriage consideration. So also the privity of contract doctrine has been relaxed for commercial reasons to allow certain positive or restrictive covenants to run with the land so as to benefit or burden persons not party to the contract imposing such covenants. The enforcement of this covenant is provided under Section 40 of the Transfer of Property Act in respect of a right to restrain enjoyment in a particular manner of the property imposed for the mere beneficial enjoyment and benefit of an obligation arising out of a contract and annexed to ownership of property. Friends, There is no difficulty in understanding this concept. And now I'm coming to collateral contract. A collateral contract, what is a collateral contract? Is between a third party and one of the parties to the main contract may be associated with the main contract. Such a contract may enable a third party to enforce the main contract. A manufacturer's guarantee is an example of such a contract, collateral to the main contract of purchase of goods. For example, I go and buy some electrical goods or some other machinery from a dealer, enter into a contract with him, and he provides me manufacturer's guarantee. It becomes a collateral contract because now it's a contract where there is a main party and the third party. Multilateral contract is where even without knowing, a person can enter into some contracts, and that is if you join a club or some unincorporated association, society, or one member joining the club is deemed to contract with other members. It does so without being even aware of the identity of the others. And only, although his communication is only with the secretary or president of the club, but he contracts with the other members without being aware of their names also. Similarly, where a number of persons enter into a competition, say cycle race or marathon or something, such persons contract not only with the organizing club, but with each other also. Friends, assignment has been defined in R.K. Associates versus Chanappa by Karnataka High Court in 1993, where they say, where an assignment of benefits under the contract is validly made, whether according to the provisions of the statute or otherwise, the promisor is faced with an action brought by a person who he did not regard as a party. Please understand, promisor is faced with an action brought by a person who he did not regard as a party or whom he did not intend to benefit. An assignee will be bound by an arbitration clause in the contract assigned. So here the dilemma of the promisor is that he is faced with action which is brought against him whom he did not even regard as a party or whom he did not intend to benefit. That is the effect of assignment, and this case becomes very important in that regard. Now, friends, I am coming to a very important topic called acknowledgement and estoppel. A stranger to a contract can sue where one of the parties to the contract afterwards agrees with the stranger to pay him directly or is stopped from denying the liability to pay. This is Noramal versus Mohanlal, Rajasthan High Court case of 1966. A promisor can also create privity between himself and third party by conduct, by acknowledgement, or otherwise constituting himself as an agent of third party, entitling the third party to sue. This is such an important case, I recommend that all of you should go through, you should thoroughly study this case of Calcutta High Court of 1996, where I am again repeating it, a promisor may create privity between himself and third party purely by conduct or by acknowledgement or otherwise constituting himself as an agent of the third party, entitling the third party to sue. This is a case where it is Moitrili Mukherjee versus Manik Chand Johri, as I said, of 1996. Friends, I am now coming to these sections where I must lay a lot of emphasis on communication, acceptance, and revocation of the proposals. The section defines communication of proposals, acceptance of the proposals, and the revocation of proposals and acceptances, respectively, are deemed to be made. Now, a person would be bound by any act or omission or conduct which appears to be an offer or acceptance, as the case may be, to the person to whom it is made. I'm saying a person would be bound by any act or omission or conduct which appears to be an offer or acceptance, as the case may be, to the person to whom it is made. I will read what Lord Diplock says. According to him, Lord Diplock, in the case of Hannah Blumenthal, 1983, All England Reports, it says, to create a contract by exchange of promises between the parties. Please mark my words. And I am reading Lord Diplock here. To create a contract by exchange of promises between the parties, where the promise of each party constitutes the consideration for the promise of the other. What is necessary is that the intention of each, as it has been communicated to and understood by the other, even though that which has been communicated does not represent the actual state of mind of the communicator, should coincide. Friends, Lord Diplock has very clearly stated that the parties where the promise of each party constitutes consideration for the promise of other, what is necessary is that the intention of each, he lays emphasis on the word intention of each, as it has been communicated to and understood by the other. This is very important in this context. And it goes on to say, now, before I come to section 4, I will say communication may be made effectively in many ways. And it can be written, spoken, signaled, words, or delivery of goods by conduct to the person who has offered to buy at a certain price. And this will signal acceptance also of the proposal. No words are needed to explain the intent with which a person steps into a bus or a tram or a ferry, puts a coin. Now this is communication, this is acceptance also. He has taken a ride, he has paid for it, and therefore it is unspoken. If he has paid if he has dropped the coin, and then it is done that he has accepted whatever was the prescribed. Now the question of intention in such transaction is solved by the provisions relating to attribution. Please understand, the question of intention in such cases is solved by attribution. Now, sometimes silence is also acceptance. Law doesn't cast a duty on the person to whom a proposal is made to reply to the proposal. It is for you. Do you want to reply to the proposal or not? And that's the case which I'd like to emphasize, is a case of Allahabad High Court, Gadarmal versus Tata Industrial Bank. However, it says further, and hence acceptance cannot be inferred from the silence. If a person, you make a proposal and the person doesn't reply, you cannot take it that he must have accepted because he has not denied. As a general rule, and again, you cannot, as a general rule, say that a proposal is not accepted or accepted by mere silence on the part of the offering. And as in Tata Bank case, it has been held that law doesn't cast a duty on you or doesn't put an obligation on you to reply to every proposal made to you. And you may keep silent on it. And the other person, offerer, cannot take that your silence is acceptance or denial or whatever. And these are called also sometimes, these are called click wrap agreements. Online service site agree to specific set of terms. Sometimes there are exceptions by means of, uh, where you acceptance is by silence, and these are called click wrap agreements. For example, online service side agree to specific set of terms. Let's come to section 4. The definition is before you. Proposal is communicated when it comes to the knowledge of the offering. Acceptance has to be notified in some perceptible manner. For example, IT Act says that the dispatch of electronic record occurs when it enters a computer resource outside the control of the originator. I am talking in the context of the computer communications. Instantaneous mode, telephone, fax, email, acceptance is, or even the postal, is by the definition as it is here. But acceptance lost or delayed in the transit, there is a presumption that when it is sent, there has to be proper address and delivery proof of dispatch and receipt. A person who has made an offer is considered as continuously making it unless he has brought it to the knowledge of the person to whom it is made that he has withdrawn. But revocation is effectual if it reaches before dispatch of acceptance. Again, it's a very important case which I will place before you for your knowledge. It is called Bhagwan Das versus Girdhari Lal, case decided by Supreme Court in 1966, AIR 1966, Supreme Court, where it was held that making of an offer did not form part of the cause of action. Please, friends, remember Supreme Court says making of the offer does not form part of the cause of action for damages for breach of contract which resulted from acceptance of the offer. This case assumes a lot of importance because the court here seems to emphasize that making of the offer did not form part of the cause of action for damages for breach of contract or which resulted from acceptance of the offer. And friends, in this same case, it was further held that a court would not have jurisdiction merely because an offer was transmitted from within its jurisdiction. Please understand, as Justice Hidayatullah said, Section 4 applied in all cases where the parties were at a distance, although communications was instantaneous. The language of Section 4 was adequate to cover new inventions. A contract is made where the acceptance is received, and the court at the place where acceptance is received has jurisdiction. This is the decision of the Supreme Court per Justice, Honorable Justice Hidayatullah. And let me repeat, a contract is made where communication is received, and the court at the place where acceptance is received has the jurisdiction. Hi friends, Section 7 of the Contract Act lays emphasis on the acceptance by the offeree. And there is a rule which all of us must understand, and it should be called the mirror rule, where the offer and acceptance must correspond exactly. There should be no variation. Intention of the offeree must be expressed with certainty. Now, let me give you some examples, and I have given some notes for your perusal here. There could be no contract by acceptance referring to future negotiations. Why do I say that? Because the intention of the parties is to be gathered from the expression used and the meaning it conveys. For example, acceptance will have to have legal effect if the new terms are brought in and are trivial. For example, A tendered to buy from the defendant 305,000 tons of coke at 31 rupees per ton and deposited rupees 5,000 as security. Acceptance of the tender and deposit of the security constituted a contract. Now, exactly that's what I was saying. The acceptance of conditional offer is an acceptance of the offer and conditions attached to it. Nobody can say, I will accept these part conditions, I will not accept the whole conditions. Acceptance means the whole, and also it has to be conveyed back in the format prescribed by the offerer. Unless it is done exactly in the format required and on the terms required by the offerer, there cannot be any acceptance. Now, let's go further, and there is a case of Kanhaiya Lal Agrawal versus Union of India, decided by Honorable Supreme Court in 2002. Exactly, it is, I have cited the case for your perusal. The acceptance of conditional offer is an acceptance of the offer and the conditions attached to it. You cannot say, I accept the offer, but I do not accept the conditions attached to it. Similarly, absolute acceptance of the offer does not result in a contract if acceptance does not extend to all terms of the negotiations. As I said a moment ago, it has to be either all terms or no acceptance. Similarly, friends, there was a case which struck me as important for your perusal, decided by the Supreme Court in 1996. It's called the case of Rajasthan Cooperative Dairy Federation versus Mahalakshmi Mingate Marketing Services Private Limited. Here, the letter of intent was issued on the term that the contractor would sign the contract and furnish bank guarantee of a scheduled commercial bank, which the contractor failed to do. It was held that the two conditions were conditions precedent to the formation of a proper contract, and the revocation of letter of intent was therefore held valid. Now, what were the two conditions? One, that there shall be a security, and two, it shall be on a scheduled commercial bank, which the offeree did not perform. Now, acceptance of a counter offer creates a binding contract. Let's see what it means. I make an offer. In result, you accept that, but you also make an offer. And thereafter, that becomes a counter offer. And if I accept that, then it becomes a binding contract. Now, there are some organizations where acceptance may be required on certain formats. It is called the battle of forms, where if a party submits a document containing terms after making the contract, it will not affect the existence of the contract. New terms will become part of the contract if they are accepted by the terms of variation. Similarly, where an agreement of a sale of lease is subject to purchaser's solicitor accepting the lease, approving the lease, the contract will be conditional. And there will be no completeness of the agreement, because the condition is that the attorney might accept, might not accept. Similarly, there was a case which struck me as important, decided by Supreme Court in 1971, and it is called the case of Union of India versus Bhimsen Vaklati Ram, where the acceptance is subject to approval. The contract becomes binding on confirmation being given, and communication of such approval is not again necessary. This is a very important case, and I must take a minute to repeat it. Where the acceptance is given subject to approval, the contract becomes binding on confirmation being given, and the communication of such approval therefore becomes irrelevant. The offerer can revoke his offer until confirmation has been received, subject to which that was the acceptance was given. As I said a moment, this case decided by Supreme Court lays down a new dimension of the acceptance. Similarly, friends, you all know that Article 299 of the Indian Constitution prescribes that the contracts with the Government of India have to be in the name of the governor or president. And therefore, that condition is again a battle of format, and that doesn't impose any new condition. Similarly, acceptance and contracts of insurance, if I may take a moment to take you into the contracts of insurance, insurer must accept the risk, take steps to underwrite the risk, and issue the policy. In the case of assured, a positive act on his part by which he recognizes to enforce the policy amounts to affirmation of it. An acceptance of the proposal on the condition that the first premium will be paid within 30 days of acceptance in law is a counteroffer. Please, you have to take the insurance contracts carefully, where a cover note comes and it says acceptance is done, but subject to the condition that the premium should be paid within 30 days and the assured doesn't pay, then there is no contract. Cover note also signifies that and it only signifies that the policy is in the preparation. And electronic record may require the addressee to acknowledge receipt in a particular form. And if the receipt is not acknowledged, mind you, there is no acceptance. Let's go to the next section, section 8. Now, what does it say? A proposal is in every case accepted by the performance. What is that? It says the proposal here, communication by the acceptor to the proposer or his agent is necessary when the terms consist of, but when only acts are required, the communication of their performance may or may not be added as a term of offer. What is it? When you joined the law course, the first case on contract that the law teacher teaches is Mrs. Carlyle versus Carbolic Smoke Ball Company, where the Carbolic Smoke Ball Company made an offer to the general public saying that if anybody buys this and inhales it as prescribed, then the smoke ball will how many? Okay. Friends, I was talking to you of the Carlyle versus Carbolic Smoke Ball Company. Mrs. Carlyle bought the smoke ball and she exactly followed the instructions which were contained along with uh, the as prescribed by Carbolic Smoke Ball Company, but she still contracted influenza. So she filed the case against the company, and the case was upheld and she was awarded the damages on the condition that when the offer was to anyone who performed on the condition on faith of advertisement and by such performance it became a contract. Therefore, Mrs. Carlyle was entitled to reward and damages. The words of Lord St. Leonard's in Mossel versus Hedges, they are very important in this case because what it says where it is not a proposal with a condition which being accepted was equivalent to a contract. Now, what does it say? It says, was this not a proposal with a condition which on being accepted became a contract? Exactly. That's what Carbolic Smoke Ball Company said. They said, if you accept that condition, buy the product and use it as per our instructions. Carlyle did that and it became a contract. Their lordships do not doubt that it was a contract. This is a very important case where words of Lord St. Leonard's in Mossel versus Hedges, which case I have provided for your notes here. So, friends, that's all about section 8 because it's an offer in general, which on performance becomes a contract, and therefore, let's move on to section 9. Section 9 talks of express and implied promises and express and implied contracts. They may be oral or in writing. And as we have quoted a case here, All England Reporter of 1962, where it says a written contract may be a single document, each party being bound by signing it. First to sign is the offerer, second to sign is the offeree. The case is called Financing Limited. And what it means is here that in a written contract, if there is a single document, where the first party signing it becomes an offer, and the second party to sign is an offeree. And it's a in again the about the express contract in Alparti Ramurthy versus Policity, which again is quoted for your perusal. Andhra Pradesh High Court held an express contract means reciprocal promise contained in the words of the contract. Now, here is a new meaning given by Andhra Pradesh. It means express contract is a reciprocal promise contained in the words of the contract. This definition is a further addition to the definition of the English court in the aforesaid case. Friends, the other contract which I was mentioning to you just now are the category under this section are the implied contracts. What are those? Where proposal or acceptance or both are signified not by words but by acts or conduct. The acts or conducts must be such that it can give rise to the inference that there must have been an implied offer or acceptance. For example, contracts by mercantile use, where you see generally in a stock exchange, in a mercantile, where the person raises his finger and it means that he has bought it. Similarly, a person walks into in my earlier lecture, I was talking where a person walks into a tramway, drops a coin, there is a acceptance by conduct, and he has accepted that. Similarly, you walk in London buses and you drop a coin. These are all where you, by conduct, you accept this. And I gave you the example of mercantile use. Now, friends, what are the implied terms? Implied terms I have tried to categorize in three parts: custom, law, and codes. What are those? Some are in certain relationships, in certain mercantile use. There is a custom, there is something that is established, and we follow that conduct by custom. Then in some cases, it is by law, where I gave you the example of, offer in general. For example, you walk in a tramway or you drop a coin, you accept it. In some cases, it is maybe by courts. What is that? The courts will interpret that to be accepted by conduct, and that becomes a contract. However, in D.V. Iyer versus Dish Board, South High Court, Madras High Court held that a promise which is excluded by the express terms of a contract cannot be implied, which is absolutely natural, because if expressly there is an exclusion, there cannot be any, you cannot put a meaning of implied consent to that. And therefore, we cannot import the consent by implication. Now, similarly, we have, as we said in a previous section discussion on Article 299, we have said that there cannot be an implied contract under Article 299 of the Constitution. Why is it? Because I said a moment ago that the contracts with the governments, central government may be in the name of President of India, in the name of state, it may be governor, and it expressly bars that there cannot be any implied contract between the government and another person, because that would nullify the provision of Article 299, and which says no contract can be inferred from the facts and circumstances of the case, and a contract not complying with the provision of Article 299 is not a contract at all. and is not enforceable. So please be very careful when you are examining a contract under Article 299 in the name of, particularly contracts with the governments, where the contracts are in the name of the sovereign government. Therefore, we cannot at that time begin to say that something was implied because it cannot be implied. Friends, this section actually brings into fore the entire gist of what you have studied from section 2 to 9, because it says a contract is a consensual act and parties are free to settle as they please, as this has been laid by the state of, in the case of state of Madras versus Ramalingam, by the High Court of Madras. It says, let's understand, it's a consensual act and parties are free to settle as they please. And now let's see the Motor Insurance Act, Motor Insurance Statute. A statute may compel a person to enter into a contract. These may be cars where parties do not enjoy freedom in making a contract, or cement sold to allottees under orders passed under Cement Control Act, or fertilizer, or some such thing. Now, these are statutory compulsions, because if you buy a car or a motorcycle, you have to take an insurance contract and you may not like it. However, in Vishnu Agencies Private Limited versus Commercial Tax Officer, Supreme Court said neither the dealer is bound to deal nor customer is compelled to purchase, though both are bound to comply with the legal requirements. This is because in a cement purchase case, where it was said that it is a compulsion of law, the Supreme Court said no. Supreme Court said the dealer is not under any obligation to deal in cement, and customer is not obliged to purchase if he doesn't want to buy. Although both are bound, but if the dealer agrees to deal in the cement and the customer has to purchase cement for his house or building or whatever, then of course they must comply with the law, statutory requirements of the sale of cement. Similarly, the contract implies two parties, natural person and the other person who have a legal personality. Some may be incompetent, for example, obviously the second, the category of people who are not competent to contract are minors, lunatics. We shall continue. Thank you.